never produce enough power to achieve flight. However, he did not seem to have integrated his ideas of engines with his flying machine concepts. True Renaissance man, if there ever was one. And toys in the form of kites, gas-filled balloons, and rotating wing tops, which today are called bamboo dragonflies or bamboo copters, were used in ancient China around 2000 BC. There were even some later attempts at building human-sized kites for carrying people. Suffice to say, however, none of these early experiments ever made it off the ground, pardon the pun. No human being would see the world from a bird's eye view until the late 1700s, and that came from the hot air balloon. The lighter-than-air vehicle was designed in France by the Montgolfier brothers in 1783. Their first unoccupied balloon, made of paper and silk, rose to an altitude of approximately 2,000 miles. A few weeks later, a larger balloon named the Air Saut Réveillon, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, was launched carrying pilot Jean-François Pilote de Rosier, and again, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, who ascended to the end of its 90-mile rope tether. A month later, de Rosier and the Marquis d'Arlandes, and again, pardon me if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, made aviation history by conducting the first free flight in a balloon which ascended to around 150 miles and traveled approximately 8 miles before safely landing. Founding father Benjamin Franklin witnessed some of these early balloon flights. He was so impressed that he predicted that balloons would soon have considerable military value for conveying intelligence into or out of a besieged town, giving signals to distant places or the like. And indeed, tethered balloons were used during the American Civil War for battlefield surveillance. They could reach altitudes of up to 300 miles, which gave a great vantage point for soldiers, who used signal flags to send information down to their comrades. Franklin later proposed that lighter-than-air concepts combined with propulsion, eventually leading to the development of concepts with rigid internal frames, which became known as dirigibles. And the first dirigible was built and flown by Henri Giffard in 1852, and was driven by a propeller powered by a steam engine. Today, an airship is defined as any powered, steerable aircraft inflated with a lighter-than-air gas. Early airships and dirigibles were filled with hydrogen, which is highly flammable. And interestingly, airships had exploded even before the infamous Hindenburg disaster in 1937. A modern blimp, which is essentially a pressure airship, is a powered, steerable, lighter-than-air aircraft whose shape is maintained by the pressure of helium gas inside the envelope. And unlike a dirigible, a blimp loses its shape when the internal gas pressure is lost. Newer versions of blimps now have a minimal internal structure made of carbon fiber, classing them as semi-rigid airships. Now, any claims about the quote-unquote Sutton invention of the airplane at the beginning of the 20th century are entirely incorrect because the origins of airplanes can be traced back many centuries. History suggests that the creation of a practical airplane was an evolutionary consequence of the contributions of many different individuals over a relatively long period of time. Now, before the 19th century, there were few scientific investigations of flight or into the science of aerodynamics. The earliest work on developing flying machines and airplanes can be traced back into two distinct categories: inventive and scientific. The former is where intuition is used instead of formal technical training, whereas the latter is where a trained, more systematic approach is used. And nearly all early developments in aviation were inventive, and you do not need to study a complex engineering system such as an airplane to make it work at its most basic level. However, understanding the underlying science is necessary to make it successful and practical. Now, as stated before, mankind has always been greatly interested in nature, especially in the form of birds. Even well into the 20th century, there were attempts to build flying machines that mimic the flapping of wings. This thinking manifested in all sorts of strange contraptions, many of which were in the form of ornithopters, all of which were unsuccessful. Nevertheless, many human-powered ornithopters, tower jumpers, and brave birdmen captured the public's attention much more than scientific endeavors. At the beginning of the 19th century, George Cayley, an English nobleman and prolific scientist, proposed various aircraft concepts, including gliders, numerous types of airplanes, and even a primitive helicopter. His glider and airplane concepts utilized a primary wing for lift generation with smaller horizontal and vertical tail surfaces for directional stability and control. Cayley constructed numerous free-flying gliders of various scales which he utilized to gain a fundamental understanding of aerodynamics and flight stability. He also coined the concept of balance of the four forces that influence aircraft flight, namely lift, weight, thrust, and drag, which later earned Cayley the title the father of aeronautics. He experimented with models placed at the end of a whirling arm device and correctly concluded that the aerodynamic forces produced on his models were proportional to the squared value of the speed at which the model moved through the air. Cayley also recognized the need for a lightweight engine to power his aircraft. However, in the mid-19th century, only steam engines were available and they were unsuitable for aeronautical use. Besides the heavy steam engine itself, it would also have to carry a boiler with ample water and fuel to produce steam. This is impractical for an airplane because such an overall system would be enormously heavy. And in Germany, a man named Otto Lilienthal developed several glider concepts, reportedly having conducted over 1,000 flights from the top of a hill in the beginning of the 20th century. A Frenchman named Octave Chanute, living in the U.S., furthered Lilienthal's work. Chanute helped others, including the White brothers, with advice on the design of flying machines. He also wrote a book about his experiences, which remains available today. Chanute's open approach to discussing developments in the evolving aviation field ultimately led to considerable disharmony with the Wright brothers. The Wrights were secretive about their work and quickly patented their ideas to protect them, eventually becoming embroiled in significant patent wars with others. However, the Wright brothers were the first to achieve successful powered flight, where others previously failed. And in December of 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright were the first to fly a powered biplane aircraft that took off and landed under the control of its pilot. The Wright brothers experimented with various biplane gliders, laying the groundwork for their powered aircraft. There remain claims that Gustav Whitehead flew a powered aircraft several times between 1901 and 1902, predating the first flights by the Wright brothers by over a year, but this is highly unlikely. Shortly after this, a man named Samuel Langley had tried to fly an aircraft with tandem monoplanes, but the wings folded up in flight and his machine crashed into the Potomac River. Aircraft structures must be strong and lightweight, but the quest for lightness means that they can become less stiff, and Langley's machine crashed because his monoplane's wood and fabric wings were not stiff enough and broke off. The Wright brothers experimented with different types of structures and developed a more rigid design in the form of a biplane. And notably, the Wright brothers designed and built not only their airframe but also the engine and propellers to power their craft. They even built a wind tunnel which they used to make systematic measurements of the aerodynamic forces on wings of different shapes, including the critical effect of aspect ratio. That is, the beneficial effects of the wing slenderness on an aerodynamic lift and drag. In this regard, they built their famous flyer with a wing aspect ratio that significantly exceeded anything else flown previously. And the Wright brothers continued to develop their aircraft designs for several years, and by 1908, their aircraft could fly for over 2 hours and cover nearly 100 miles. Now, Wilbur Wright died in 1912, but Orville lived until 1948. Orville witnessed many milestones in aviation, including the invention of the jet engine, but also saw the destruction caused by airplanes being used as weapons of war during World War I and World War II. And several significant advances in aircraft development and aeronautical engineering occurred during and after World War I, and rapid developments in engine and propeller designs continued. The Wright brothers demonstrated that a propeller required large aspect ratio blades with nose-down twist along their length to achieve good propulsion efficiency, a key factor in their success. And although monoplane wing designs were slowly emerging, the biplane design continued to undergo various improvements, including methods for strengthening the wings and airframe, as well as reducing the drag caused by structural bracing and wires. Early airframes, however, were made primarily of wood and covered with doped cotton fabric. Wood is readily available, durable, and easily worked construction material. However, such a construction method is limited because it becomes increasingly structurally inefficient for heavier and larger types of aircraft. And more publicity for aircraft came in 1919 when two Englishmen named Captain John Alcock and Lieutenant Arthur Whitten Brown became the first people to fly non-stop across the Atlantic Ocean. They were competing for a prize of £10,000 offered by the Daily Mail, and they flew from St. John's, Newfoundland to Clifton, Ireland, a distance of more than 1,890 miles in their twin-engine Vickers Vimy biplane. And during the flight, which lasted more than 16 hours at an average speed of almost 120 miles per hour, the pair overcame equipment failure, fog, and ice, eventually crash landing unhurt in a bog they had mistaken for a field. Alcock and Brown became known as heroes and were knighted by King George V the following week. Amazing to think that just 16 years earlier, two bicycle-making brothers from Ohio had created the first powered airplane. America began to take flight history when, in 1926, Charles A. Lindbergh, the chief pilot of the Robertson Aircraft Corporation, stowed a bag of mail in his DH-4 biplane and took off from St. Louis to Chicago, forming one of the first transcontinental flights. And 1 year later, he would make history as the first, and 1 year later, in 1927, he would make history again as the first person to fly transatlantic solo when he flew from New York to Paris. However, it was not until the 1920s that commercial aircrafts and airlines really came forward. This may have been because of the introduction of the multi-engine airplane, the Lawson C-2, which was specifically built to carry passengers. And during this time, more and more startup airline carriers were being established, some of which are still in operation today. These include KLM in the Netherlands, Colombia's Avianca, Qantas in Australia, which was founded in 1920, and Czech Airlines, which was established in 1923. And aircraft from this period would land frequently to refuel and fly at lower altitudes due to unpressurized cabins. And early flights were uncomfortable and expensive. Traveling through it by airplane was a luxury only the wealthy could afford. And in 1936, America became one of the first, and in 1940, American became the first airline to introduce airport lounges for customers. American Airlines in 1944 operated its first scheduled air cargo flights from New York's LaGuardia Airport, making it the first scheduled air cargo service. And in 1945, American Airlines began operating transatlantic services for the first time with American Overseas Airlines. By 1955, more people were flying than driving the rails. And I'm sorry, folks, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap this episode up. So thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed our little trek through the skies, if you were. And I think we've learned that just because you failed once does not mean you have failed permanently. After all, just ask the Wright brothers. With that, I would like to say goodbye and God bless.